Welcome back to the Next Respect Project talk. Today is a very exciting talk for me personally. I get to talk about two things I'm very passionate about. One is our new movie, Switched Before Birth, that is coming out on Lifetime October 23rd. And I'm here to celebrate that premiere, as well as talk about infertility, which personally has touched my life. And that is what Switched Before Birth is about. But we are very privileged to have with us some medical experts, one very personally close to me, Dr. VICKEN SAHAKIAN, who is my fertility doctor and is responsible for my beautiful miracle baby, Easton. I did several rounds of IVF, so we're here to talk about infertility then when I was trying to become a mom, infertility now, and also the future. So Dr. VICKEN SAHAKIAN is the medical director of Pacific Fertility Center. We have Dr. INGRID RODI with us, who is an infertility specialist, as well as a reproductive endocrinologist. We have SKYLER SAMUELS, who's one of the stars of Switched Before Birth, and coming from her perspective, not being a mom yet, but wanting to have a family at some point, and was very committed to this role in this film. And so we're excited to talk about this extremely topical movie coming out in October. We have Kay Gay, who is in pharmaceutical sales, but also she is somebody who has an IVF success story and was a patient of Dr. Sahakian's. And we have Tina KEUROGHLIAN, who is also an IVF success story with us to talk about this really important topic. 13 years ago when I was trying to be a mom, I walked face first into this sort of glass wall of infertility. Nobody was talking about it. We weren't doing each other a service by being open and honest about it. In fact, I'd say we were probably, those of us struggling with infertility, maybe even a little ashamed. And I can share with you, how I kept it a secret for a year until I decided to come out about it on behalf of other women and also men. There's an element with Switched Before Birth that it's not only the female characters that are struggling with infertility, but also one of the male characters. So it touches both genders. But even 13 years later, it's sort of staggering to accept how taboo this topic still is. And in Switched Before Birth, there is an incident that happens, and that is the climax. It's the dramatic point of the film that I feel is very closely linked with how much we still are struggling with infertility as a taboo. So without further ado, I'd love to ask Dr. Sahakian, what are the most common taboos around infertility, and why still 13 years later after I've had my child are, people still struggling with this and living in silence or not coming out of the closet, so to speak, about their infertility struggles on behalf of others, because, it continues to be a huge issue that people are struggling with privately. And I just am curious why the taboo around this topic.
First of all, I don't understand how you look the same now that you looked 13 years ago. So that's a major trick that you have. But I'm privileged to be part of this panel and to know you and become friends over the years. There's no question infertility is a taboo still. And if you look actually across the globe, in certain cultures, it's much more of a taboo than it is in our USA culture. But even in this country where I've been practicing for 30 years, Dr. Rodi has been practicing even longer than me, we see certain groups of patients, certain cultures where they come in, not only they don't want to tell their family or friends, but they're ashamed themselves that they're actually suffering from infertility. And I always say, like, let's say you had hypertension. Do you really fear telling your friends or your family you have hypertension because it's a disease that you suffer from? And yet when it comes to infertility, even more in males than females, it's like you're handicapped in a bad way, as if you had a choice of struggling with this condition. I'm Armenian, and in our culture, it's crazy how Armenian patients would not refer even patients to me because they're ashamed to admit to their friends that they had a baby. My best friend had twins with me 15 years ago. Still to this day, no one knows in our circle that I was a doctor. Tina, who's one of my patients who I've known for years and had multiple kids with me, is a rarity to go around and talk about me or doctors and basically telling them it's not shameful to be infertile. K, who used an egg donor to have a baby, you know how hard would it be for me to convince a patient who had to use an egg donor to have a baby to come on a panel like this? It's impossible, even today. It's shameful to be infertile. It's shameful. It's even more shameful if you're a man and you have low sperm count. It's like you lost your virility. It's shameful if you're an older woman and you want a kid. Like they would chastise you if you're 48 and you wanted a kid and you couldn't have a child. Imagine, you know, a man at 55 wanting a child. No one thinks that's an issue. And if he has a child, actually, he becomes this macho guy that he was able to. Well, if the same happens with women at 55 or 54, it's totally a taboo. It's like you're not supposed to have a kid. So not only the disease itself, the gender, your gender makes you shameful of suffering from this. If you're older, it's a taboo. You don't want to admit it. If you need to use an egg donor, or let's say you want to use a surrogate to have a baby because you had a hysterectomy, or for whatever reason you can't carry a child, imagine telling your friends you need a surrogate to have a kid. I had two patients, one of them from Boston, who actually, when she had difficulty getting pregnant, she needed a surrogate. And when I got her surrogate pregnant, she bought these little online, I guess maybe you can buy them from Amazon, to show that she's pregnant to her friend until she was 6 months pregnant, showing a belly. And then she said, I had to fly to San Francisco to have my kid because I had complications, so that her family and friends don't know that she used a surrogate. You look around the world, in certain countries, most countries actually, surrogacy and egg donation is illegal, let alone shameful. It's illegal. You can't get a donor in England and France and Italy and pay them to give you eggs. You can't get a surrogate in those countries. China, Australia, they come here for surrogacy. Even in this country, many states are not surrogate friendly. New York just recently changed their laws. Until then, to get a donor, you have to go to another state to do your IVF. So these are some of the examples I'm sharing with you of how infertility today is still a taboo. It's still shameful to be part of it.
Well, and the disease of infertility and the shamefulness around, or the taboo aspect that, you know, many people feel around this culturally, to your point, or, you know, what have you. I mean, I don't, you know, I want to stay neutral and be Switzerland, but I just want to say it does have something to do with then the ultimate result of the medical industry and the federal government, you know, regulating this industry, because there's an aspect of our movie Switched Before Birth that deals with human error. And I'd like to talk about the statistics of human error, but I'd also, you know, like to ask, you know, Dr. Rodi, again, to stay with this understanding of taboo. And I want to give some props to Lifetime, because after Switched Before Birth comes out, they are going to have a 15-minute special called Beyond the Headlines, where, you know, there will be a conversation much like this, you know, or a documentary about, you know, the topic of infertility, because the more people know, the less they will suffer as they go through this journey. And SKYLER Samuels' character and Justina Machado's and Bo Yoakley and Yancy Arias, they really struggle through their infertility story. And then there's a twist, and Dr. Sahakian knows about that twist because he was the medical expert on Switched Before Birth. But I want to stick with the understanding of, you know, the taboo element of it, and, you know, why is there taboo around this subject, Dr. Rodi, and how does that influence the medical industry and our federal government supporting people who are struggling from the disease of infertility?
Well, I think that you know, it's multifactorial, you know, so clearly there are families who look down on, you know, usually they look down on the woman, even if it's their son who has the problem, the daughter-in-law gets the blame. And so there's a lot of, you know, how it makes the family look if they can't have kids. And that goes back very far. But then the problem is compounded by the fact that in many situations, the process is expensive. And then the question is, you know, how do you pay for it, and who in the family can you get to help you? And the fact that in some states, fertility treatment is mandated, and some states it's not. So that makes it difficult, because some patients aren't as much embarrassed about the fact that they're infertile. They're embarrassed about the fact that they can't pay for the treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And then the process is just upsetting to them, you know. So it's there are any number of reasons why women and certainly men don't talk about it. And then you get into the whole issue of anonymity, which of course doesn't really exist anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are all kinds of people who thought they were donating anonymously, or the parents who thought that they were being donated to anonymously, that are now being identified because of 23andMe and other things like that.
Skyler, just so that everybody on this talk knows the switched before birth sort of log line, you don't want to give everything away, but just sort of, you know, what the journey was for your character and Justina's character, and you know, just to give a little bit of background behind the plot for Switched Before Birth. Could you share that with everybody?
Yeah, absolutely. So Switched Before Birth is looking at my character, Olivia, and Justina Machado's character, Anna. I play my own age, someone who's 27, 28 years old. Justina is a woman in her late 40s. Both of us are desperate to have a baby, and we both have tried and failed multiple times with IVF treatments. And what I like about the movie is that it's not just an age thing. It's not just a woman in her late 40s who's quote unquote past her prime, or, you know, a geriatric pregnancy, which I find to be the most offensive term.
That was me. I was very young.
We got to do away with that. But I also like, you know, on the other hand, that you have my husband and I in the movie, who's played by Bo Yoakley. You're looking at a young couple who's having problems, so that it's not just, you know, an age issue. It's, I'm 27 years old and I can't get pregnant. And the movie is centered around their IVF journey. And essentially what happens is, during implantation, because of human error, there's a mix up, and my character ends up carrying both one of my eggs and one of Anna's eggs.
Embryos, yeah.
And so, you know, of course, we have the children, all hell breaks loose. And, you know, the story that ensues is basically trying to understand how such a thing could happen, and the fact that it is really hard to deal with when we go to court and are trying to legally figure out the best course of action, because there is no federal oversight, and how human error was the cause of utter heartbreak, and, you know, sort of all that comes with that. So
Dr. Sahakian, you talked about that as a topic. Thank you, Skyler. You talked about yesterday, because I was sharing with you more about the plot and sort of we were going through that, your thoughts about human error and, you know, the percentage of it and how it impacts you, and, you know, and so forth. So can we talk about that a little bit?
I mean, it's everyone's nightmare, not only a patient's nightmare, but imagine a doctor's nightmare on many levels for a doctor. Number one, obviously, it's a tragedy when there is an error like that. It's sometimes impossible to fix. Second, as a doctor, you know, you can be as good as you can be, but you don't control every step of the process. It's not like you're doing surgery and you could, you know, harm someone. It's someone else in a chain of custody of events of basically eggs and sperm uniting to make an embryo, and then being frozen and being thawed and being transferred. Errors could happen at every level.
Right.
Yeah, so it is a nightmare. There is no question there's human error, and it will continue happening. But if you think about the incidence of these human errors, given the enormous amount of IVF cycles being done around the world in the millions, it's really minuscule. So the odds are very small. And the reason is very small because we all fear those mistakes, and we take every step to try and prevent from these mistakes from happening. And I told you yesterday, not recently, I had a case where I was about to do the transfer. And we have a protocol. The protocol says the embryologist comes in with the embryos and then loaded in a catheter or the embryo, and then comes in, and I'll tell the patient, please state your first and last name. She checks on a sticker on her wrist to make sure the name matches. Now, given, obviously, had she loaded the wrong embryo in that catheter, it's irrelevant what's happening here. But in this case, the name did not match. So, and then she said, doctor, I have a different name. This is an embryo from a different patient that you're doing next. I said, well, then the system works. So she went back and then got the right embryo. But that's how close you can get for doing a mistake, and yet how how easy it is to prevent it. And yes, it was prevented, but I can see human errors happening at every level. In your movie, what's interesting, can it happen? Yeah, it can happen. Embryologists, working with several patients to do transfers on that morning. And let's say they're really busy and, by mistake, they take an embryo and load it in the wrong catheter, and here you go, someone else will have that baby. So there is no question human error is still present, but the odds of human error during IVF is extremely, extremely small. So that's that part. What was the other issue?
I was just asking, what is the role of the federal government and the lack of, federal regulation over the industry? How does that influence sort of the business,
it influences it in many ways. Number one, there's no real oversight. I mean, there is some oversight when you're using third-party parenting, like egg donation and surrogacy. But even then, it's very superficial oversight. There's absolutely no oversight on how IVF is done, literally. Success rates are reported, but even then, they're not really scrutinized. So it's the Wild West. We can do whatever you want. I mean, unlike other countries where there are more strict regulation, there aren't any regulations here. And then what happens when a mistake happens, like in your case with that movie, is you have someone carrying somebody else's child. And yet it's no one's fault. If you think about it, if I'm an egg donor and I donated my eggs and you created embryos and you had a baby yourself, and I come back to claim that's my baby because I'm the genetic mother, I have no claim because I willingly donated the eggs to you. So you will win that in court and you will be the biological mother. Now, there's a difference between genetic and biological mother, right? Most of the time, the genetic and the biological mother is the same. It's your eggs and you carry the baby. So I call it genetic because it's the source of the eggs. Biological is because you're carrying the baby. So in my opinion, and this is my opinion, is that if you unwillingly are part of a mistake where your eggs created an embryo that was transferred into the other, patient's uterus and she had a baby, you have a legitimate claim saying, well, that's my child. I didn't donate that child to you, and you should win a case in court. What makes it complicated, which I don't know if what was the issue in that movie, is that what if the sperm was mixed up? So you get the sperm, let's say you're a couple, we use your husband's sperm to create an embryo with somebody else's eggs. Now you have two different genetic sources, and then whose baby it is. That is the nightmare that you could deal with, that I don't know the answer to that. In that case, I don't know who would win. But in the case where by mistake an embryo was transferred to someone else and you get a baby, I think the genetic mother should basically get the baby back.
Well, we won't tell you what happens in Switched Before Birth, but I think it's a very an ethical conclusion, but very difficult and very, very complicated. And it is interesting to me, sort of the legal aspect of the, fertility industry, as well as, what you as medical experts hope the government's evolution will be, as well as the medical insurance companies and so forth, because as you talked about, due to the aspect that this is still such a taboo subject, it can financially decimate families to try to have their families that they deserve to have, that they've always dreamed of having. Financially, it puts people in just disrepair. It was extremely expensive for me 14 years ago. I could barely afford it. And I can only imagine that it's still very much the same. But you were talking about, just to sort of broaden this outside of the topic of just the plot behind Switch Before Birth, let's get into surrogacy. And again, you know, really making these topics more comfortable for all of us to discuss, because we have to break those taboos so that we can make progress societally. And everybody does deserve to have the family they always dreamed of. And I just don't understand why, if there's the science behind it, why it continues to be something that women or families or just have to advocate for themselves. Just as a sidebar, Dr. Rodi, we were talking about how, you know, 13, 14, 15 years ago, women had to ask their gynecologist to be tested, to have their hormone levels tested or their FSH levels tested, and advocate for themselves to figure out where they were at in their fertility journey. You know, some people can get pregnant in their later years. Some people, like Skyler's character in Switched Before Birth, finds out in their 20s or 30s that they, or I could see Kay nodding, that, you know, finds out early that they have infertility disease. You know, why is it that we have to advocate for this kind of information? I'm curious about that from you. And then Kay, I would just like you to talk about sort of your IVF success story and sort of your struggle with the taboo around what you went through.
Well, the getting the information out is a little complicated in that, you know, I was a gynecologist before I was a fertility specialist. And so I carried over the idea that I wanted to alert women of their situation and aging, and that it really is very young when you can start having issues. And, you know, most women appreciated that, but I got a certain amount of pushback. I mean, some significant pushback, you know, that I was just trying to make, you know, business for myself, giving people this information. So it's not uniform in terms of what women want. The other thing is that we have to worry a little bit about wanting federal oversight, because what that means is that you could have somebody making rules that you don't believe in. So I have a woman right now who had breast cancer, and she froze eggs where she lives in England and in LA, and she needed a surrogate, and she had her first baby that way, but she would like to have the second baby with the eggs that she has in London, but she can't transport them to the US if she's going to use a surrogate. So you either have to lie to the authorities in the UK, or you can't use a surrogate. So I would say, you know, the ethical and the religious and all those issues, you want to have as much latitude as possible.
Very, very interesting. Kay, do you want to talk about your experience a little bit?
Sure. And thank you. I just want to say thank you, Elisabeth and Dr. Sahakian, for even inviting me on this project. I think it's really important that, you know, there needs to be more talk about this. I know with me, myself, you know, my sister, she was in her 20s when she had her child, you know, and she had twins. So of course, you know, I'm in my 40s and I just assumed that I wouldn't have any problems either, you know, but I really didn't know about infertility. I didn't know about IVF. I didn't know about embryos, eggs, you know, any of that stuff. It wasn't until I was part of a premarital counseling before I got married, and I met a girlfriend that was there. And, you know, it was a group of us girls all together, and she was talking about, you know, kids and babies, and she was already, you know, had a child. And she was like, have you guys ever gotten your, you know, your eggs checked to see where you are? And at the time, you know, I was like, I wanted to do it the right way. I wanted to get married, you know, first career, married, then, you know, have a child, you know, so it wasn't really on the forefront, you know. but one of my cousins, she was more hyped than I was, and she was like, "I'm going to go see Dr. Sahakian," and she ended up having fibroids. You know, in African American women's, fibroids is very, very common. The thing is African American women, it seems like they have a lot more infertility issues, but they don't really go and get things checked. And I don't know if this is true, Dr. Sahakian, but we just don't talk about it. It's not discussed. And that's kind of where I was, you know, where, you know, I really didn't, you know, take heed of it. And of course, by that time I had waited a little bit too late. I tried with my, by the time I went to go see Dr. Sahakian, I did like, you know, I think I did like 3 rounds of, you know, retrievals. Those were unsuccessful. And then we got to the point where, you know, Dr. Sahakian had mentioned, you know, have you tried, you know, a donor, or have you thought about thinking about a donor? And it hit pretty hard. I mean, you know, to think that he was like, well, I mean, you could carry, you know, I don't see any problems with you carrying, but, you know, the quality of the eggs, you know, you're going through the money, and, you know, and thankfully with my company, I'm a pharmaceutical rep. I was able to pay for, they covered around like $20,000, I think, but it didn't cover a lot. So, you know, it was a lot, you know, but we got to the point where I was okay with, you know, thinking about a donor. But then it got to the point where trying to find an African-American donor was tough, and finding an agency that actually had, you know, African-American women. So it took me a year to actually find someone, you know. Thankfully we came across an individual, a female girl, and she was great. I mean, I think she ended up with like 22 like eggs, and which was great. And, you know, thankfully I was able to, you know, have a beautiful baby girl now, who is like 13 months old right now. So, it was a tough, you know, I wouldn't say that it was easy, but, I'll say having a support group. I think a lot of the staff at Dr. Sahakian's office were my cheerleaders in the background, you know, because there's many a times I just wanted to be like, you know what, I can't do this anymore. I'm done. And then months later, I'd be right back, you know, because it's like you've spent the money, and you know, you're committed to it. So, I mean, I'm just grateful and thankful that, you know, me and my husband were able to financially, you know, because we spent a lot of money, but, you know, we were thankful for that. So it was definitely a blessing, but I'm so happy now, and everything was worth it. And I thank Dr. Sahakian for putting up with me and my tears and crying and all that. So,
yeah,
but yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell.
me too. But yeah. I want to say thank you for what you said, which is, you know, in the beginning, and just for being open and being here, willing to talk about it, because I do think we all need to start talking about it more on behalf of each other, so that the reproductive generation doesn't continue to have, you know, the same issues that you found that you had, as well as the ones that I had. Or Tina, I want to hear from you as well. But I agree with you. I ended up keeping it a secret for a year. My partner, the father of my child, was also ashamed of my infertility, which didn't help the topic. And then I started blogging about motherhood, and I don't know, I just felt like what service was I doing by celebrating my baby, bouncing my baby on my knee and celebrating my motherhood, if I wasn't willing to come out of the closet and talk about how lucky I was? Why aren't we celebrating medical and scientific advancements where we can have these things happen for us, and have these doctors that are here with us today that help us to have this future family that we've always dreamed of? Why isn't that something to celebrate? why are we in closets, still, struggling with coming out and talking about that, so that we can help other women, Skyler's generation and younger, have the families they always wanted, so that you don't discover at 40 or 34, that's what I was, that you can't get pregnant, and nobody was talking about it. And celebrities and, people who are public figures not talking about it and celebrating their twins, and not saying, well, I did IVF and here's why I want to talk about it, because I don't want other people to struggle with the same things I struggled with. Power, knowledge is power. Let's get that knowledge out there on behalf of other people. And I ended up writing a book called Having the Child I Always Dreamed of, just not the way that I wanted. I think that's what it was called. It was called Baby Steps anyway. But I decided that, I wanted to get out there, much like, I guess Dr. Sahakian said, Tina's also been very vocal, so that other people don't struggle with this lack of knowledge, this lack of information. So we have to advocate for each other. And it takes one, like you said, having the conversations now and raising your hand and saying, well, let me go first. Let me tell you my story. I hope it helps you with your future goals. Tina, what was your journey with having your children and your family expanding?
Well, my journey, again, I thank you, Elisabeth, for having me on this panel, and Dr. Sahakian, who has become my utmost best friend. Little did I think that I would connect with my IVF doctor and be friends with him for life. But my story is a little more difficult. My husband is a cancer survivor. So 6 months after we got married, he was diagnosed with T-cell lymphoma. And that was very tough on me, on him. We were young. We were 27 years old, just married, just about to start our life, and then boom. So with struggling with that, it took us 9 years. For me, it wasn't the taboo of not being able to get pregnant. We had to, immediately take his sperm, freeze it, store it. And, there was so much going on that having a child at that point, although it was what we always wanted to, was not an option. So my first goal was, let's get my husband better. Let's make sure that he's going to be okay before we even think about that. So thankfully, he went into remission, everything went well, and, given 50% chance to survive, he survived 100%. So, with all that said, and then it was time now, 5-6 years had passed, and we wanted to have a baby. I loved babies. Everybody around me was getting pregnant, and I was faced with, we kept trying and trying, even though they told us it wasn't possible. I didn't want to give up. So, it's like you go and you buy, pregnancy tests every month, and you pee on that stick and you're like, did it happen this month? I mean, the amount of pregnancy, sticks that I've used, I can't even count them. And, obviously they never worked. And then,
I relate to that.
IVF was always like, oh my God, like, I don't want to have to do that. If, I was meant to have babies, and if I was meant to be a mother, the universe, God, they would all help me. And I was so close-minded with that because I couldn't accept it. I did a whole bunch of artificial inseminations. I mean, you name it, I did it. Until, my gynecologist is like, I think you should go see Dr. Sahakian. And I was like, oh my God. All right. So, we pulled ourselves together, went to meet him, and it was almost as if, it was like love at first sight. He just knew what to say. My husband and I would just looked at each other, and he just made everything so easy, so simple. So, he approached it in such a, non-aggressive way, where I had gone prior to Dr. Sahakian. I'd visited with many different doctors, and they were so aggressive and so pushy, and, they just, pushed me away. And I guess it was just, meant to be. So, I finally agreed to do it. I hated needles. I hated everything about what I was about to do. I was so scared. But from the beginning, I never kept my journey a secret. I kind of shared it with everybody around me, and I took everybody through this, the steps that I went through. I asked for help. I reached out, and Dr. Sahakian's staff, phenomenal, amazing. His nurses, everybody there was, so helpful. So, I pulled my strength together, and I said, okay, we got this. We're going to do this. I was 35 at this point, and my clock was ticking, and I wanted to, you know, go for it. So we did. And the first round with Dr. Sahakian, I ended up pregnant. And it was scary, it was exciting. So from that moment on, it was almost like a new world opened for us. And my husband and I, like, I'm gonna get emotional about this, couldn't believe that we were actually gonna have a baby in our hand. And we were going through the motions. And I made my husband, once everything was good, I told him, go to CVS and buy me pregnancy sticks. I need to pee on that stick and I need to see that. They're positive. I still have those. I did 3 of them back to back.
You're like, I really am pregnant.
I'm
pregnant.
So I mean, it's been a journey. It's been something to talk about.
Yeah.
I've never been ashamed to talk about it.
You're lucky. You're really lucky. I don't think a lot of people feel that way. And, you know, you're really a champion, you know, by feeling so comfortable. It took me, like I said, a good year to kind of come out. And then, you know, Dr. Sahakian and I now have known each other, what, 14, 15 years. I mean, and we've been beating the drum together to continue to get this information and these tools out, like you're talking about, to everybody, because, you know, suffering in silence about your infertility or peeing on the stick and not seeing the results you want.
It's horrible.
It's really horrible. Yeah.
But I'm blessed with 3 children. I've got a almost 11-year-old daughter, and I've got almost 7-year-old boy and girl twins. So, I mean, honestly, Dr. Sahakian is somebody that I admire, I look up to. He is one of the most amazing human beings I've ever met, and I can't thank him enough for everything he's done for me and my family.
I know. Listen, when we're all talking about him, I thought I was the closest best friend, and now I'm seeing all these other best friends. Dr. Sahakian, I thought we were so close. No, I'm just kidding.
I thought I was.
We all are. That's why we're all here together. I think that's what it is.
It's true. And one thing I will say, you know, the more information people have, and they don't suffer in silence as they experience miscarriages, or, you know, whether it's male infertility, you know, or whatever that may be, you know, if you are struggling to get pregnant, I learned this from Dr. Sahakian, be proactive on behalf of yourself. Be your advocate. This is still, like he said, the wild, wild west. People are not talking about it, and communities have not fully come together to support one another, the reproductive generation, so to speak, with their future goals of having children. So, you know, if you're noticing that you're not getting pregnant the old-fashioned way, be proactive on behalf of yourself. And there are incredible people like Dr. Ingrid Rodi and Dr. VICKEN Sahakian available. And I hope that, you know, we can continue these conversations, because many people do suffer in silence. SKYLER Samuels' character in Switch Before Birth had 4 miscarriages, was in a sense an IVF addict, you know, kept going back and was just struggling and struggling, and probably, had it not worked out, would have needed to do a surrogate. And again, all of these things are to be celebrated and not to be taboo and to be suffered in silence. I'm just curious with you, SKYLER, thinking about your future family, do you find in your generation, in your friend circle, in today's zeitgeist, that all this information feels really accessible? IVF is talked about, freezing eggs is no big deal, surrogacy is like whatever, you know, I mean, what's your perspective? We're all a little bit older.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's a mix. So I am privileged to have girlfriends kind of, you know, younger than me all the way up until 40. So it's kind of interesting having that span of women in my life. And, you know, the conversation of egg freezing has definitely been pretty prevalent, you know, maybe for my girlfriends who were in their mid to late 30s. And so I'm kind of looking to them, you know, they're 8 to 10 years ahead of me, sort of what that process is like and what they went through. And I was very surprised at the cost. And they were like, SKYLER, you should do it right now, because, you know, the younger you are, the better they are. And I'm thinking, okay. And then when I had even inquired about what it would cost for me to freeze my eggs now and keep those babies on ice, I was like, I could buy 4 houses. Like, this is insane. It's, you know, it's so expensive. So it's tough, because now probably would be a good time. And at the same time, there is a real financial burden. And I also know that at the moment I have a girlfriend who's pregnant because of IVF, and I have another girlfriend who's expecting twins via surrogate. And it's been really interesting talking with them both, because they're still not sure how to talk about it. Especially my girlfriend, you know, who's expecting via surrogate. It's hard, you know, whether or not she wants to disclose that. And there's still, I think, a sense of stigma or shame around that. And same with my girlfriend who has IVF. I think as women, we're just expected to be like, well, this is the one thing we were designed to do. So like, if you can't do that, you're broken. And I think men probably feel the same way. It's like the one thing people meant to do is make other people. So if you can't do that, you're like, oh my God. But it's starting. The conversations are starting, and I'm very grateful, Elisabeth, for, you know, the initiatives that you've taken, and our movie, hopefully a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I do really want to say thank you to Lifetime, because Lifetime doesn't only make movies, they make movements. And this is a movie that is a movement. And again, after you see Switched Before Birth, beyond the headlines will be a 15-minute documentary about this topic. And we're going to continue to share this conversation with the Respect Project about infertility, you know, so that we can keep the conversation going. But let me be naive for a second. Dr. Sahakian, Dr. Rodi, why is freezing your eggs so expensive? And why is doing IVF so expensive? Explain that to us that don't know, because people who are struggling with infertility walk blindly into a situation they cannot afford, and then they put themselves into oftentimes financial disrepair as they try to tackle this problem. I mean, even if they are advocates for themselves.
Ingrid actually sees a lot of women for egg freezing. Ingrid, why don't you give your 2 cents on this, because you see so much of it?
Well, the process is expensive because it involves expensive medications, and it involves, you know, a lot of monitoring, and then the lab, and then the freezing. So, I mean, it is just expensive. Now, it's important to try to get to egg freezing before 35, and for some patients even before that, because otherwise it becomes more expensive. I mean, if you can do this at 32 and have 1 egg retrieval per baby, that ends up being, you know, sort of the least expensive you can get. But if you do it at 37 or 38, you may need multiple retrievals. And the other thing is that the parallel project is if you want to find a male partner, that needs to be part of the approach, because you get much more information if you freeze embryos than if you freeze eggs. And especially for women who are in their late 30s or 40s, you have no idea how many eggs you're going to need to make the number of babies you would like. So, you know, it's a big project, and one of the things we have to think about as a society is a way of supporting women so they can have children earlier.
And my point of view on that too, Liz, is that am I on mute? Yeah, it's important. If I would be black and white and send a message to, let's say, women under 35, which 100% concur with Ingrid, the older you are, the more eggs you need to freeze. That's and then the less you make. So the more eggs you need, and then the less you make, translate into multiple IVF cycles to get to that magical number we like to see, like 30 eggs, 20, 30, 40 eggs. So my message is, if you're 27 and you're not ready, you don't have a partner, at the least once a year, have simple ovarian reserve testing, which includes a blood test and an ultrasound. That gives you an idea of where you stand. And then thereafter, if you do it once a year, and if you're getting into your, 32, 33, everything looks great, freeze your eggs. Now, if you have the money, and it's going to cost you about $10,000 to $12,000 to freeze eggs, do it the younger you are. But if you're getting into your 30s, you got to find enough loans somewhere to at least do a round of IVF and freeze 20, 25 eggs, and then kind of put it in the back burner and don't worry about it. It's like you're buying an insurance. You're buying insurance for the future. You don't have to use those eggs. Hopefully you'll never have to use them. But if you're in your late 30s, 40s, and everything else failed, even when you found a partner and tried, frozen eggs are your last resort. And if you have them, I always say to my patients who come to want to freeze eggs, I said, it will give you more time to find a man. That's pretty much it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Why are men, why are men, in switched before birth, there's male infertility as an issue as well. And I would be remiss to not talk about that because, women are sort of the focal point. But, what is the percentage of male infertility versus female infertility? I'm just curious.
I mean, with male infertility, it's still about 30–40%, but with women postponing childbearing, the women's age becomes kind of the main issue now. Mm-hmm. And the main difference between men and women when it comes to reproduction is simple. Women run out of eggs at 51, 52, you're in menopause, but way long before that, in your early 40s, you've run out of good eggs, while we make sperm until we die. So our sperm really doesn't deteriorate to the point where we're infertile until probably never. Mm-hmm. And then whereas in women, you have pretty much 20 to 22 years to have kids. And then if you go to college and have a career, then much of it is gone. So you have a handful of years to be able to conceive using your own eggs. So hence why freezing your eggs would really give you more time to, finish your career, let's say, and be in a place where you're ready to have a kid with a partner. In men, that's not an issue. We can wait forever to have kids. It's unfair, but that's how it is. Blame there.
Right. Well, to get into some of those sort of cultural issues, Dr. Rodi, do you think that the issue of shame and the taboo around infertility can really ever fully change, with its scientific advancements and more, open discussion about infertility as a disease? Because that distinction meant a lot for me to understand, but to sort of challenge those taboos, do you think it's really possible for us to make this topic something that is no longer taboo in the future?
It is. I think the biggest problem for the United States is that we're heterogeneous. So different people have different opinions about this. If you have a small country that is very homogeneous and you give, let's say you have national health insurance, so it's not a financial burden, and you have very good early child care. So women, for example, in France have it easier to have children when they're younger, even if they're going to pursue careers. I think you can get much closer. Mm-hmm. But we're in a very difficult situation in this country because we're so polarized. So there are some people who don't even want IVF as an option, never mind egg donation or surrogacy. And the polarization we can see even in the fact that surrogacy isn't allowed in some states. So I think that we have our work cut out for us in this country.
I was going to say, I mean, if there are no federal oversights, which may be a good thing, as you pointed out, and I'm not a doctor and I'm certainly not an expert. I'm just a person who's experienced, IVF, and this is an incredible learning curve for me to spend time with you guys, especially the experts. If there is no federal oversight or very little, what do you guys hope the future looks like for your industry? Dr. Sahakian, you're muted.
Ideally, obviously, you want to see insurance coverage. Yeah, I mean, to be fair to the populace, because this is so expensive, everyone should afford to do it. Otherwise, you have a portion of the population who basically cannot have kids, as simple as that. Mm-hmm. So even though being transparent, we make more money when it's a cash business, it's not fair for the populace. This needs to be covered by insurance. This needs to be mandated so that everyone has access to it. And I think when that happens, the next step would be to remove the age limits. And I'd say, like in certain states, you can do IVF, it's insurance covered, but you have to be less than 40. Well, slowly that age limit should be extended and then finally removed so that even women who need an egg donor would be able to have the financial help to do this process. So if you ask me what I wish would happen in the near future, is that everyone has access to it. It's like, you know, health coverage. You know, if you have diabetes, you need to be able to get insulin. And if you don't have money, somebody has to pay for it. And I think that's what I would say.
Imagine that in the last 30 years ago, pregnancy wasn't covered. So you could, you know, you'd have a baby, you'd have to pay for it because that was considered elective. So we can make progress. I mean, now everybody would be shocked if you couldn't get OB care. And I think I agree with Dr. Sahakian that we have to go in that direction.
And there was also a time when, before women stood together holding hands and arms to protect our health, that our OBGYN community was not asking us to do mammograms. I mean, we have to come together, we have to unite, not divide on this topic, and, you know, respect science and be grateful for these victories that we are able to have with our future families because of doctors like you. And certainly as Tina and Kay and I all feel very grateful to have the children that we have because of the medical help that we were able to get from Dr. Sahakian. I just want to honor this one question that's in the message room. Maya was wondering if any of us have considered fostering or adopting as a part of our journey. She lost her uterus due to a tumor in her late 30s and recently became licensed to adopt and foster. I have actually thought about it. Unfortunately, unlike what Dr. Sahakian said, you know, having many frozen eggs would be a great plan. I didn't have those and don't have them, even though I was very young when I discovered that I had fertility issues. So it's something I very much considered. But it's complicated, and I think we all want to have our own biological children. And actually, you know, the question of does biology make you a parent is a topic in Switched Before Birth, and it's a complicated topic because the truth is it does not, that is not how you define being a parent, you know. And I know that Kay could speak to that. I know for me, if I had another child, I would have to get an egg donor and I would be that child's mother. So it's an incredibly complicated topic, I think, for everybody. Anything you want to add, Dr. Sahakian? Or
I think you covered a lot of topics here. We didn't talk about miscarriages, which is also important for just to say a couple of words about that. It's, you know, not getting pregnant is actually not as hard as miscarrying multiple times. And so women who miscarry twice, they need to go seek help. And as I always say, you know, I wish someone didn't get pregnant versus getting pregnant miscarried, because the pain with the miscarriage is even 10 times worse, because you thought you're there, you're dreaming about the room, and the room doesn't come true. So not only if you're having a hard time getting pregnant, but if you've miscarried a couple of times, it's time to see a doctor. So that's part of the same spectrum. Infertility through miscarriage has to be looked upon as part of the same spectrum.
And I would recommend that every woman who is planning to get pregnant or would keep the pregnancy if she did get pregnant, make sure that she is as healthy as possible and do what we call preconception evaluation, so that, you know, we don't have complications during the pregnancy that could have been avoided. The other thing the preconception visit allows is that if a woman isn't ovulating, then, you know, hopefully that would be identified as, she would be identified as someone who needs help right away, as opposed to waiting the year that supposedly you're going to wait. Mm-hmm. Or if we know that one in the couple has had cancer, you know, the woman may still have periods and the guy may think he has sperm, but, you know, you're not going to wait to a year to evaluate somebody who's had cancer. Mm-hmm. And especially who's been treated for that cancer. So I think that we also need to focus on getting and making sure we're healthy to embark on this journey, rather than what is more common, which is just throwing caution to the wind.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, thank you for being a part of this Respect Project conversation about infertility. It's surprising to me that it still remains so necessary for us to talk about it. I am so grateful to Lifetime for making Switched Before Birth and creating not just a movie, but a movement around the topic of infertility. Please watch the film on October 23rd. Please hang in there and then watch the Beyond the Headlines documentary about it. And please keep sharing your stories with those that you know need to hear them in any topic whatsoever, not just infertility, but let's keep telling the truth on behalf of other people so that we can help others in their journeys in life, and especially with infertility. Let's break those taboos together. Thank you for joining this Respect Project talk. And you can go to www.therespectproject.org to learn about our future talks. And thank you, Kay. Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you, Skyler. Thank you, Dr. Sahakian. And thank you so much, team, for coming and being a part of this talk today on infertility and breaking the taboo.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us, Elisabeth.
Thank you, Elisabeth.
Bye, you guys. Thank you.